Have you ever heard that some encounters happen simply because they were meant to be? Sometimes, two souls cross paths at the exact moment they need each other the most. This is the story of a girl and a mare, an unlikely friendship that would change everything. When Grace, a child full of dreams, received the worst news of her life, it felt like her world was crumbling around her. But then, in the moment she least expected, she met Hopi, or perhaps, Hopi found her first. What did this connection between them truly mean? How could a simple animal turn a little girl's final days into something so extraordinary? Stay until the end to discover how a bond, once formed, can go beyond time, beyond words, and become eternal. The hospital always carried that unmistakable scent of antiseptic and air conditioning that was far too cold. The silence was only broken by the steady beeping of the monitors and the soft sound of Grace's breathing. She lay in bed, her small fingers intertwined with her mother's, while her father stared at the ceiling, as if searching for answers in a place where none could be found. From her bed, Grace watched her parents. They tried to look strong, but their eyes betrayed the fear and pain they carried. Her mother, sitting beside her, held her little hand tightly, as if afraid to let go. Her father paced back and forth, his shoulders tense, taking deep breaths to keep his voice from trembling. The doctor entered with soft steps, her expression calm but carrying an invisible weight. Grace's parents already knew. For months, they had lived between tests, results, and treatments that promised hope but were always followed by new complications. Yet, hearing the final confirmation, that there was nothing more to be done, felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath them. Grace already knew. She had always known. She didn't need the doctors to say it out loud. The way the nurses spoke in hushed tones around her, the pity in their eyes, the longer visits from her parents filled with heavy silence, everything told her that her time was running out. Her mother closed her eyes for a moment, feeling as if the air had been sucked from the room. Her father rubbed his face with both hands, trying to suppress the anguish growing inside him. It was impossible to accept. But what hurt Grace the most wasn't the illness. It was seeing her parents suffer for her. With a tired smile, she squeezed her mother's hand and, in her sweet voice, tried to comfort her. She wanted to tell them that everything was okay. That they didn't need to be afraid, that everything happened for a reason. Her mother blinked quickly, swallowing hard to hold back the tears. Her father turned to the window, taking deep breaths, trying to hide his own. But Grace saw. She wanted to tell them she wasn't afraid. But she couldn't lie to them. That night, while her parents dozed beside her, Grace stared at the hospital ceiling, wondering about the future, even if there wasn't much of it left for her. For Grace's parents, all that remained was to try and make their daughter's days as light and pain-free as possible. But how? How do you bring comfort to a little girl who still dreamed of a future she would never reach? That night, as Grace slept, her parents sat on the hospital couch, surrounded by darkness and the muffled footsteps of nurses walking down the halls. They needed to do more. They needed to find something that would bring joy back into their daughter's days. Then, among countless searches and medical articles, they came across something different: equine therapy. Studies spoke about how being around horses could bring happiness, ease pain, and reduce anxiety. It wasn't a cure, but it was a chance to give Grace something beyond hospital rooms and medication. Her mother's fingers slid across her phone screen, stopping on photos of children smiling as they stroked the gentle animals. Her father exhaled slowly, looking at their daughter. If they couldn't give her more time, they could at least fill the time she had left with happiness. And so, they made a decision: Grace would go to the horse ranch. What they didn't know was that this choice would change everything. The next morning, they told Grace about the horses. Her eyes lit up. Horses. She had always thought they were beautiful, but she had never had the chance to see one up close. For a moment, she forgot everything: the pain, the medicine, the hospital. "I'm going to meet a horse?" she asked, excitement in her voice, something her parents hadn't heard in a long time. They nodded, forcing a smile, and Grace felt her heart swell with a new kind of hope. She knew that there were still beautiful moments waiting for her. And she couldn't wait to live them. The next morning, as the car turned onto the dirt road leading to the ranch, Grace felt the cool breeze brush against her face. For the first time in what felt like forever, the sterile scent of the hospital was replaced by something new, the perfume of nature. The earthy aroma of damp soil, the scent of freshly cut grass, and the warmth of the sun embracing the open fields. She gazed out the window, her eyes shining with excitement. She had never been to a place like this before. The sky stretched endlessly above her, a vast canvas of blue. In the distance, wooden fences framed rolling pastures where horses trotted freely, their powerful strides moving in rhythm with the wind. The sound of distant neighs mixed with the rustling leaves, creating a melody so different from the beeping machines and muffled voices of hospital hallways. Her parents, sitting beside her, exchanged a glance, a mix of relief and emotion. It had been so long since they had seen that spark in her eyes. When the car came to a stop, Grace took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the crisp, clean air. The exhaustion she had carried for months was still there, but somehow, it felt just a little lighter. Stepping out of the car, she let her gaze wander, absorbing every detail. Near the stable, a group of children giggled as they brushed a chestnut-colored horse. Not far from them, an instructor gently guided a young girl onto the saddle, leading the horse with patience and care. Everything felt so peaceful, so different from the suffocating routine of the hospital. Then, something unexpected happened. From across the field, a white mare lifted her head. She had been grazing quietly, but now her ears perked up, and her deep, intelligent eyes locked onto Grace's. For a moment it was as if the world around them faded, leaving only the two of them in silent connection. Without hesitation, the mare began to walk toward the fence. Step by step, as if she knew exactly where she needed to be. The ranch staff noticed the movement and exchanged surprised glances. "That's not normal," one of them murmured. Grace stood frozen, her heartbeat quickening. Why was this horse coming to her? The mare stopped just in front of her, lowering her head slightly, extending her muzzle as if waiting for Grace to make the first move. A mix of hesitation and wonder filled the little girl's chest. She had never touched a horse before. Slowly, almost nervously, she stretched out her small hand, her fingers trembling as they neared the animal's face. When she finally made contact, a shiver ran through her. The mare's coat was warm beneath her fingertips, soft yet strong. The gentle heat radiating from the horse contrasted with the cool morning air. And in that moment, everything else disappeared. The hospital, the treatments, the pain, all of it faded. For the first time in a long time, Grace felt something new, peace. She closed her eyes, letting herself get lost in the quiet rhythm of the horse's breathing. Slowly, she matched her own breath to it, trying to absorb that tranquility. Beneath her fingertips, she could feel the powerful heartbeat of the animal, steady, strong, full of life. A lump formed in her throat. How could something so simple feel so profound? Her parents, watching from a short distance, exchanged glances, their eyes glistening with emotion. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they could feel it was something special. Grace's lips curled into a small but genuine smile, and in a whisper, she said, "Hi, friend." The mare let out a soft breath, as if answering her. And in that moment, an unbreakable bond was formed. The days that followed were unlike anything Grace had ever experienced. Each morning, her mind was no longer occupied with tests, doctor visits, or a new round of medication. Now, all she could think about was going back to the ranch. The white mare, whom they had named Hopi, seemed to always be waiting for her. The moment Grace arrived, Hopi would lift her head and walk toward her, as if she knew exactly where she was meant to be. Among all the children, all the trainers, she had chosen Grace. At first, Grace would simply run her hands along the mare's neck, feeling her calm breathing, the warmth of her body, a quiet reassurance. But soon, she began helping with her daily care. Brushing Hopi's coat became Grace's favorite part of the day. The rhythmic motion of the brush against the soft white fur helped her forget everything else. With each stroke, it felt like a weight was being lifted from her shoulders. Hopi, as if she understood Grace's frail arms and slow movements, stood completely still. She never shifted abruptly, never made an unexpected move. If Grace grew tired, Hopi would lower her head and wait patiently until she was ready to continue. Even at feeding time, Hopi was careful. When Grace offered her slices of carrot with her delicate fingers, the mare would take them so gently, never letting her teeth touch Grace's skin, as if she knew just how fragile her friend was. Then came the big challenge, her first ride. When the instructor suggested she mount the horse, Grace hesitated. Her arms and legs were weaker than before, and the thought of falling sent a shiver down her spine. But before fear could take over, Hopi stepped closer and gently rested her muzzle on Grace's shoulder, as if whispering, "You can do this." With the trainer's help, Grace was lifted onto the saddle. Her heart raced. Feeling the mare's strength beneath her was overwhelming. But then, as Hopi took her first slow steps, something magical happened. Hopi moved with extraordinary gentleness, each step careful and light. She didn't trot, didn't make any sudden movements. It was as if she knew she needed to be as soft and steady as possible. The sensation of being up there, floating above the ground, moving as one with Hopi in a slow, steady rhythm, was indescribable. For the first time in so long, Grace felt free, not confined to a hospital bed, not trapped in an illness, not weighed down by an uncertain future. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the wind brush against her face, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin. In that instant, she was not a sick child. She was just a girl, happy. From a distance, her parents watched with their hands clasped tightly together. Her mother wiped away a silent tear, while her father smiled, his eyes glistening. They had never seen Grace look so alive. Grace opened her eyes and leaned forward slightly, whispering to her mare. "Let's go slow, my friend. But let's go together." Hopi let out a soft neigh, as if she understood every word. And from that day on, neither of them would ever be alone again. The ranch didn't just change Grace. The transformation rippled through her entire family. Her parents, once weighed down by worry, began to breathe differently. Their gestures became lighter, their smiles calmer. At first, they watched from a distance, unsure. They feared Grace might get too tired, that she was too fragile for this new routine. But as the days passed, they realized she was more alive than ever. Each time they saw their daughter smiling as she stroked Hopi, it was as if fear lost a little more of its grip on them. Grace's mother, who had spent so many nights awake at the hospital, crying softly so no one would hear, now spent her days capturing every moment on her phone. Her father, always so serious and quiet, started asking the instructors questions about equine therapy, trying to understand why this horse had become the greatest source of comfort for his daughter. But beyond that, they felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Every glance exchanged between Grace and Hopi, every burst of laughter when the mare's soft muzzle tickled her skin, every silent conversation between them, it was a gift. They hadn't been able to save their daughter from the illness. But, somehow, they had given her something even more precious, the chance to be happy, despite everything. One afternoon, as they watched Grace ride, her mother gently squeezed her husband's hand and whispered. "I had forgotten what it was like to see her like this, so full of life." Her father didn't answer right away. He simply nodded, gripping his wife's hand a little tighter, because he knew that if he spoke, his voice would break. The ranch became a sanctuary for the family. It was the only place where illness wasn't the center of everything. Here, Grace wasn't a sick child. She was just a child. And her parents, who had once only seen the future as something filled with fear and sorrow, began to understand that, no matter how short time might be, their daughter's happiness in the present was what truly mattered. And for that, they were eternally grateful. Winter arrived, bringing with it a cold and quiet wind. The mornings at the ranch were still beautiful, but Grace no longer had the same energy as before. Her body was more fragile, her steps slower. Every movement seemed to demand more effort than the day before. The coughs became more frequent, and her face, once flushed by the sun, grew paler with each passing day. Everyone knew. Her parents avoided speaking about it, but the way they looked at their daughter, with love mixed with silent sorrow, said everything. They were preparing for the inevitable, even if their hearts refused to accept it. And somehow, Grace knew too. She no longer spoke about the future or made plans for the next day. But she still smiled every time she saw Hopi, as if to say that the present still mattered. The days at the ranch became shorter. She tired quickly, and often, instead of riding, she simply sat on a bench near the stable, breathing in the scent of the earth, listening to the sound of hooves against the ground. And Hopi seemed to understand everything. The mare no longer ran through the fields as she used to. Whenever Grace arrived, Hopi approached slowly, as if afraid that any sudden movement might hurt her. When the girl sat on the wooden bench, the mare remained by her side, lowering her head and resting her muzzle in Grace's lap. Her breathing was deep and steady, almost as if trying to share her strength with her friend. Grace's parents watched from a distance, their hearts heavy. They knew their daughter wouldn't have many more mornings like this. Then, one afternoon, as Grace ran her trembling fingers through Hopi's mane, she looked at her parents and whispered, "I want to ride, one last time." The request was like a silent blow. They knew what it meant. Lucas held his wife's hand, feeling her tremble beside him. They wanted to protect Grace, to hold her in their arms and beg her to rest. But at the same time, they knew they had to let her have this final wish. With infinite care, they helped Grace onto the saddle. Her arms were weak, and even the simple act of holding the reins took all the strength she had. But her eyes shone. The air was freezing, but she didn't feel it. Nothing else mattered but this moment. Hopi needed no command. She stepped forward with astonishing gentleness, as if she knew this was a sacred moment. With each step, Grace's heart beat stronger. There was no pain, no exhaustion. She was free. The icy wind tousled her hair, the scent of damp earth filled her lungs, and the rhythmic sound of hooves was like a soft melody, carrying her gently. Her parents watched, tears streaming down their faces. They knew. And then, Grace smiled. She leaned her face against Hopi's mane and whispered, "Thank you, Hopi." The mare let out a soft whinny, as if answering her. Her last ride had been perfect. That morning, Grace's house was silent. A different kind of silence. Heavy. Still. As if time itself had stopped. The sun was rising slowly, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. But inside her room, the light of life was beginning to fade. Grace lay in bed, wrapped in soft blankets, her breathing weak and slow. Her body no longer fought against the illness, but her face was serene, almost at peace. Her parents were by her side, holding her small hands, unable to contain their tears. They knew this was the moment they had feared the most. But they also knew they had to be strong for her. Grace slowly opened her eyes and smiled, a gentle smile, as if to say that everything was okay. Then, with one final breath, she left. Her mother gripped her hand tighter, as if trying to keep her there for just a little longer. Her father closed his eyes, allowing silent tears to fall. She was gone. But not before living moments that had made her truly happy. The day of the funeral was marked by a gray sky and a cold wind. Family and friends gathered, but all eyes turned towards someone special. Hopi. Grace's parents knew that the mare needed to say goodbye. And as they led her to the ceremony, a hush fell over the crowd. Hopi walked slowly toward the small white coffin. Her deep eyes reflected a silent sorrow, a grief that no words could express. She approached gently, lowering her head until her muzzle rested on the coffin. For long seconds, she remained still, as if waiting for Grace to open her eyes and smile at her one last time. Then, something happened. A single whinny broke the silence. It was filled with emotion. A call. A farewell. Many wept at that moment, not from absolute sadness, but from the beauty of what they had just witnessed. Grace and Hopi had chosen each other from the very first day. And now, even separated, the love between them would live on forever. The house felt too big without Grace. The silence that was once comforting had now become a painful reminder of her absence. Her toys remained untouched. Her clothes still carried her scent. The little pink room, once filled with laughter, now held only echoes of longing. Her parents felt a sorrow only those who have lost a child can understand. A suffocating grief. An emptiness impossible to fill. But in the midst of their mourning, there was also gratitude. Grace had left this world without fear, without suffering. Her final days were light, filled with love, with smiles, with the wind in her hair, and freedom on Hopi's back. She hadn't spent her last moments confined within cold hospital walls. She had lived. And though the pain was unbearable, her parents knew they had done everything they could. They had given their daughter a farewell filled with joy. Sometimes, they found themselves reliving the memories, Grace smiling as she fed Hopi, her eyes shining as she rode, the way she closed her eyes and felt the breeze on her face. Those memories hurt. But they also warmed their hearts. Sitting on the porch, looking out toward the distant stables, they knew the pain would never fully fade. But knowing that Grace had left wrapped in love and happiness made it a little more bearable. They had lost a daughter, but gained an unforgettable story, a story of courage, friendship, and pure love. And that not even time could erase. Grace's life may have been brief, but it was intense, meaningful, and filled with love. She taught us that it's not about how much time we have, but how we choose to live each moment. Her bond with Hopi proved that the connection between humans and animals goes beyond what we can understand. Sometimes, we don't need words to be understood. All it takes is a look, a touch, a silent presence that soothes our soul. Grace may have left, but she left behind a legacy of strength and joy. She chose to live her final moments in the most beautiful way possible. Feeling the wind on her face, the warmth of the sun on her skin, and the unconditional love of a being who had chosen her from the very first moment. And perhaps, that's the greatest lesson we can take from her story. Life is fleeting. Time is uncertain. But while we are here, we should seek the things that make us feel truly alive. Because in the end, it's not time that defines a well-lived life, but the moments that leave eternal marks on our hearts. And Grace, with her courage and her friendship with Hopi, became eternal in the memory of all who had the privilege of knowing her. If you followed the story this far, give it a like, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this.